Okay, so start now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our event today, which is the launching event for the Syrian British Consortium's investigative report regarding the August 2012 Daraya massacre. My name is Mazen Gharibah. I'm the executive manager of the Syrian British Consortium, SBC, which is a UK-based Syrian-led political advocacy group aiming to amplify the voices of Syrians who are committed to the establishment of inclusive and democratic Syria. The SPC works closely with our partners to inform the British government and parliament and other international policymakers toward achieving the same. Before we dig deeper into our in-depth reports and findings and our discussion, just let me clarify some of the technical details. Our report is now available on our website in both Arabic and English, and we will be posting relevant links in the chat box throughout the event. This event has a simultaneous translation. You can choose your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. It is also recorded and being live streamed on SPC social media pages. Finally, if you have any questions, please write your questions in the Q&A chat box so our team can assign them to our speakers and panelists. Now I will just quickly switch to Arabic just to clarify some of these technical details before switching back to English. مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا كثير لانضمامكم معنا لليوم بهاي الجلسة المتعلقة بتقرير اللي اشتغل عليه المجلس السوري البريطاني حول مزار الدارية. أنا اسمي مازن غريبي، المدير التنفيذي للمجلس السوري البريطاني. وكنت عم أقول بأنه قبل ما نبلش بنقاشنا قبل ما نفوت بعرض التقرير وأهم نتائجه، بس كنت حابب نوه على بعض الملاحظات التقنية. هذا الإيفنت في ترجمة فورية عربي إنجليزي. رجاء إذا تختاروا اللغة اللي حابين تسمعوها، تحت بأسفل الشاشة بالزوم في أيقونة تشبه شكل الكرة الأرضية، بس تضغطوا عليها فيكم تختاروا خيار اللغة. التقرير الكامل انتشر على موقعنا اليوم، وخلال هذا النقاش رح نحط نحن على المكان المخصص للشات رح نحط اللينكات لحتى تقدروا تطلعوا على التقرير. في حال كان عندكم أي أسئلة، رجاء تكتبوا الأسئلة أو التعليقات بالقسم الخاص بالأسئلة والأجوبة اللي بتلاقوه أيضا تحت بأسفل الشاشة. كمان حابب نوه بأنه هذه الجلسة عم تنبث بشكل عام مباشرة على صفحات السوشيال ميديا للمجلس السوري البريطاني. Now I will be switching back to English. As you know, today marks the 10th anniversary of the Daraya massacre. Over 700 people were killed by the regime forces. Almost 514 dead civilians were identified by name, including 36 women and 63 children. More than 153 people were detained, and an estimation of more than 80 people are forcibly disappeared till this day. It is estimated, of course, that these numbers, the actual numbers, are much more higher. Daraya was the beacon of hope in our Syrian collective consciousness. It's the birthplace of the peaceful and non-violent popular movement against the Syrian regime. It is where peaceful protesters like Yahya Sharbaji and Ghiyas Matar gave water bottles and flowers to regime soldiers in 2011. Those same soldiers who brutally massacred an entire city, leaving behind hundreds of families, mourning their loved ones, hoping to hear any news from the forcibly disappeared, and determined to hold all perpetrators to account. Our report, which was published today, is the first in-depth investigation into this planned and coordinated attack 10 years ago, based on witness accounts and open source intelligence. It exposes how the Syrian regime forces launched a systematic attack against civilian population in Daraya between the 20th and the 26th of August 2012. To discuss this report and its key findings and the reality of what happened in Daraya, during that week, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Yasmine Nahlawi. She is the a legal consultant with research focus on the Syrian conflict and serves as the head of SBC's investigative project on Daraya. She's also a co-founder of Huquqiyat, an organization to promote women lawyers and legal practitioners to lead justice processes in Syria. Yasmine delivers international law training to Syrian organizations and is a guest lecturer at various American and British universities. Her book is The Responsibility to Protect in Libya and Syria, Mass Atrocities, Human Protection and International Law. Yasmine received her PhD in Public International Law from Newcastle University in 2016. We also have Samah, a pseudonym of a very courageous field nurse who personally treated many victims in one of Daraya's field hospitals. Fadi Dabbas, a witness and a media activist from Daraya, where he helped organize and documenting protests and non-violent activism from the beginning of the uprising in 2011. He became a member of the Media and Public Relations Office of the local council of Daraya City when the office was established in 2012. During the August 2012 attack against the city, Fadi documented hundreds of deaths. In 2016, he was forcibly displaced from Daraya to northern Syria as part of the forced evacuation of the city. From there, he moved to Turkey in 2017, where he worked with several local organizations. Fadi studied business management in Gaziantep University and graduated this year, 2022. We're also very proud to have Sareta Ashraph with us. Sareta is a senior legal advisor at the Center for Justice and Accountability, where she's involved in case building work concerning crimes committed in Syria and Iraq. Sareta has a long-standing focus on pursuing accountability for crimes committed during the Syrian conflict. From 2012 to 2016, she served as the chief legal analyst on the UN Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. And in 2017, she was part of the startup team of the IIIM. Sareta has also served as the director of field investigations at the UN investigative team to promote accountability for the crimes committed by ISIS, and also a chief legal analyst to the UN Commission of Inquiry on Libya. Prior to this, Ms. Ashraph was a legal advisor to the Defense Office of the International Criminal Court and a defense co-counsel before the Special Court for the Sierra Leone between 2003 and 2009. Last but not least, we have Mohammad Abdallah. Mohammad is the executive director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. Prior to 2011, he was a human rights and democracy researcher and activist. He received a Bachelor of Law from the Lebanese University in 2007. And in 2014, he received a Master's of Public Policy from George Mason University with a specialty in governance and international institutions. He previously worked as a research assistant for Human Rights Watch in Beirut, from where he covered Syria from 2007 to 2009. Mohammad is a former prisoner and the survivor of torture who was imprisoned in Syria on 2 separate occasions for his work defending human rights and lobbying for political reform. Thank you everyone for being with us today, and thank you for all the participants and attendees. Without further ado, I would like to start with you, Yasmine, to give us an overview about the report, its key findings. The floor is yours, Yasmine.
Thank you, Mazen. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm going to start off by giving an overview of the investigation that we conducted into the August 2012 Daraya massacre, talk about some of the key findings and also some of the challenges, but also the successes that we had throughout the investigative process. I'm going to start with an overview of the massacre itself, just for people who don't have context. The attack against Daraya started on August 20th of 2012. The regime blockaded the city, set up checkpoints so that people couldn't enter or exit the city. It enforced a communications blackout of internet, mobile phone connection, and electricity, and proceeded to start a shelling campaign against the city that was relentless and which targeted hospitals, schools, and civilian areas. after the 5-day shelling campaign, which lasted between 20th and 24th of August, the shelling stopped and the infantry forces entered the city from multiple directions. And they proceeded to conduct mass executions, door-to-door executions of men, women, and children. And I want to briefly outline 2 of the major sites of the massacre, also for further context. The first major site where killings happened was in the Saqqa building, named after the Saqqa family, which lived in that building. Men were rounded up from the area, brought to the basement of that building, against the wall, and to take off their shirts, presumably so that soldiers could be confident that they had successfully shot them. And then a sound came through the walkie-talkie, "I can't hear any shooting." And the soldiers proceeded to shoot all 70 or roughly 70 men. And all of them were killed with the exception of 4 survivors. And the only way that they survived was either they pretended to be dead or they sustained injuries that led the soldiers to believe that they were dead. So basically, there weren't supposed to be any survivors from this building. And when the soldiers finished, they went upstairs to the apartment upstairs where the women and children of the Saqqa family were hiding, and they proceeded to kill every single woman and child in that apartment, including at least 1 infant, and there were no survivors from this apartment. In the second major location in the Sareta intersection, the regime set up a checkpoint, and this was a very significant intersection because families were seeking to flee Daraya to Damascus from this intersection. So the regime set up a checkpoint here, and it confiscated gold, money, electronics, personal items from the people as they were trying to flee, led them down an alleyway, and proceeded to shoot them. There were 2 survivors who lived to tell the story because they thought that they were going to be dead anyway, so they might as well try to escape, and they were indeed successful in escaping. So there's no doubt that the Daraya massacre stands as a collective tragedy for the people of Daraya. And so many of the witnesses that we talked to stressed that they could smell blood and that they could smell death for months and months after the massacre. And that just speaks to the sheer volume of the blood that was spilled throughout that week, and also to the deep trauma that it imparted. So I want to talk about 2 big picture findings with respect to our report. And of course, I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the report for further details. The first is that this attack against the city was directed against the civilian population. It wasn't the case where civilians were collateral damage or incidental targets. And we have some indicators in this respect. The first is that there was no Free Syrian Army presence in the city when the attack commenced. So the Free Syrian Army, which was resisting the regime army, was stationed outside the city, and it had purposely pulled out of the city so that there wouldn't be any military objectives within the town, and they were engaged in skirmishes with the regime at the outskirts. Meanwhile, the shelling campaign, which lasted 5 days, was directed towards the city itself, and thus the casualties from the shelling were almost exclusively civilians. Another indicator is that we have at least 36 women and at least 63 children who were documented as killed throughout the attack on Daraya. And finally, other indicators by witnesses through their testimonies emerged, which also confirmed that civilians were the direct targets, including, for example, that the Saqqa building from which I described earlier, the men that were rounded up and brought to the building were in their pajamas and their slippers. And so we're not talking about military combatants here. The second big picture finding that I want to share is that this was a planned and coordinated attack. It wasn't sporadic in any way. And again, we have some indicators in this respect. The first is the way that the attack commenced. So the blockade of the town, setting up of the checkpoints, the communications blackout. Second is the pattern through which infantry forces entered into the city, how they advanced, how they sectioned off the city, how they proceeded to commit the door-to-door summary executions. And finally, the number of units, military units, paramilitary units, and intelligence units that were involved in enforcing or in carrying out this massacre. And we know that the Air Force Intelligence, the 4th Division, the Republican Guard, Shabiha, as well as Hezbollah and Iranian militias were all involved. And there's no way that this attack could have been committed by all of these units without prior coordination and careful planning. And we know that these units were involved also through indicators shared with us by witnesses, including their uniforms, insignia, the types of weapons that they had, the geographic area within the city in which they were operating, their languages or dialects, conversations that they had either with each other as soldiers or with some of the witnesses that we interviewed, and finally links to detention. So we were able to track some of the detainees that were detained from the massacre and see which detention centers they ended up in. I want to briefly turn to speak about some of the challenges, but also some of the successes that we had as part of the investigation. The main challenge is the passage of time. So today marks 10 years from the most significant day of the massacre, where most of the executions took place. And there are obvious difficulties with conducting an investigation that happened 10 years ago. Namely, some of the key witnesses that we wanted to speak to have since died or had been detained. There were obvious difficulties also with recollection of some of the finer details, especially given the traumatic nature of the events. But on the other hand, I also want to share some of the successes that we had as a team. And the main one is that we were privileged to be able to work very closely with the Daraya community and to establish trust between the investigative team and the residents of the city. And this might come down to two factors. The first is that as a team, we all have some personal connection to Syria. All of us are either Syrian, of Syrian origin, or have some other personal connection to Syria. And so it wasn't the case of we were approaching this as interviewer and interviewee, but rather as Syrians invested in a common objective of justice and accountability. And that really helped to establish trust with those who we were working with. And the other thing that we endeavored to do throughout the investigation was to model it on a participatory approach. So it wasn't the case where we were going in, taking the witness testimony and then leaving to do our own analysis and produce our own outputs. It was the case where we were constantly trying to receive feedback from the witnesses, communicating with them step by step, how we were using their information, where it would go, what they could expect, but also what they could not, what maybe we couldn't do with respect to the information, and also solicit their suggestions and their feedback. And for this reason, we were very humbled that our social media profile, our social media campaign, as well as the media pieces that have been produced in connection with the Daraya massacre have very heavily centered on victims' voices. And also today, in this event, we're very privileged to have two witnesses to share with us firsthand their accounts as well. I want to end with a few thank yous to people and entities that made this project possible. Firstly, thank you to the Center for Justice and Accountability for their continued support, guidance, and mentorship throughout the investigative process. Thank you also to the Syria Justice and Accountability Center for making available video evidence within their database related to the massacre. Thank you also to the investigative team who worked relentlessly to ensure that the findings of this report are made public, and some of whom cannot be identified for security concerns. And the final and most important thank you goes to the witnesses who not only shared with us some of the most difficult moments of their lives, but also entrusted us with their testimony to share it with the wider public. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmine, for this briefing of the report, and I encourage everyone to read the full report because it has a lot of details. Now I will move to Samah, which is again a pseudonym of a very courageous nurse who witnessed a lot of these atrocities in Daraya herself. Samah will be speaking in Arabic, so if you're listening to the Arabic, the English channel, you might change the interpretation. Samah, if you can hear us, we would love to hear from you. The floor is yours.
السلام عليكم، يسعد أوقاتكم جميعا يا رب. راح أحكي مباشرة بالموضوع. ببداية القصف تعرضت المدينة جدا لغارات عنيفة. بهذا الوقت أنا كنت متواجدة بمشفى الفاروق. المشفى تحولت بسرعة كتير فظيعة لمكان مليء بالجثث والمصابين. بلاط المشفى الأبيض تحول لبركة كبيرة من الدماء. لسهولة الحركة كنا ننشف حتى الدم من الأراضي يعني. أول مصاب وصل على المشفى كان شاب عمره 24 سنة، كان مدني طبعا. تعرض لرصاصة قناص كانت في الرأس. آه، كان طبعا أول حالة بتوصلني، فحاولنا إنه بس الشاب كان عم يموت يعني. فحاولنا قدر الإمكان إنه بس نضمد مكان الجرح. رفعت رأس المريض، وهرل دماغه وكل شيء داخل الرأس على بين إيديه. كانت صدمة كتير كبيرة. ما كنت أتوقع إنه حدا من الشباب بهذا العمر يصير فيه مثل هي الشيء يعني. الرصاصة كانت فاجرة الرأس بشكل كامل. انهارت أعصابي وبلشنا إنه بحالة توتر فظيعة، لكن ما كان عنا وقت كافي أبدا لأنه نبكي أو إنه نعيش بحالة صدمة أو أزمة. استشهد أحمد وطلعت من الغرفة لحتى أشوف شو الأوضاع برا، وطلعت تفاجأت بالكارثة اللي كانت موجودة. الشهداء عبت أراضي المشفى بالكامل. كانت المشفى تحولت مثل لمقبرة بصراحة، وغرف الإسعاف كانت مليئة جدا بالجرحى. لدرجة إنه كل سرير فيه عليه مصابين، والأطفال على كل 3 بالسرير ما عدا المصابين يلي على الأراضي. المشفى تحول يعني المشهد كان بشكل عام مليء بصراخ الأهالي، بصراخ أهالي الضحايا وبآهات المصابين وألمهم. صرت أمشي من فوق الجثث لحاول أتأمل الأشخاص المستشهدة، إنه هل في حدا من أهلي أو من معارفي أو من أقاربي، لأنه بهذاك الوقت كان طبعا مقطوع الاتصالات عن المدينة وما كان في أطمن على حدا نهائيا. استهدفوا المشفى بهي الأيام بغارات جدا عنيفة. كانت بمعدل قذيفتين خلال 5 دقائق أو أقل حتى. كان هدفهم قصف النقاط الطبية والقضاء على الطاقم الطبي بشكل كامل، لأن الطبية بهي الأساس كانت هي ركيزة أساسية للصمود. وكان هالأمر سبب تنقلنا بين كتير نقاط المدينة، حتى نحافظ على سلامة الجرحى والطاقم الطبي. من أحد المواقف اللي جدا كانت مؤثرة هي إصابة طفلين كانوا بعمر 9 سنوات. هن أبناء عم، وصلنا واحد شهيد على المشفى والثاني كان مصاب برجله إصابة جدا خطيرة كانت ممكن تؤديه للبتر. بس هو الطفل كان ما همه إصابته، كان يقول لي أنا كتير منيح، بس شوفي محمد لازم يكون عايش. بلشنا هم بهي الفترات نتنقل بين المشافي بشكل تقريبا باليوم 2 أو 3 بسبب القصف اللي كتير كان عنيف. فمن أحد المواقف اللي صارت بتوجع القلب، كأنه يعني كانت إنه شيء بيشتر القلب من نصين. تنقلنا بين النقط الطبية، فات على المشفى شاب صاحب شخصية قوية البنية عم يسعف أحد زملائه. بعد نص ساعة من المشهد جابوه محمد بإصابة خطيرة، قذيفة دبابة أدت لبتر رجليه الثنتين. كان الموقف مؤلم جدا يعني. صرت إنه عم بتطلع فيه وأنا وعم ساعد الطبيب، لكن يعني أنا عم بطلع فيه عم ببكي إنه خلال يعني نصف ساعة كان هو جاي على المشفى مبتور القدمين. مشهد جدا كان مؤلم. لكن ضياء صار يطلع فيني اللي ما تبكي رجلي سبقوني على الجنة. آه، عملنا له إسعافات الأولية، ومن بعدها كمان رجعنا انتقلنا على مشفى تانية كانت المشفى قريبة من مقام السيدة سكينة. بهي المشفى كانت القصة اللي ألمها هلأ موجود جوات قلبي. آه، بالمشفى كان في عنا 6 مصابين طبعا، ما عدا الإصابات اللي كانت عم تجي وتطلع مباشرة يعني. أما المصابين اللي كانوا بالمشفى متواجدين هن ضياء كان مبتور القدمين، وشاب عامل عملية فتح بطن، وفي رجال كبير كمان كان مصاب بقذيفة وراحوا فقد بصره على أثره. وكان في عنا 3 مصابين ثانيين إصاباتهم كانت تتراوح ما بين الخفيفة والمتوسطة. بهذا الوقت كان النظام عم بلش يتقدم على المدينة. فقرروا الشباب إنه يطلعوا الصبايا أول شيء الممرضات من المشفى، كرمال إنه لتخفيف الأضرار يعني نوعا ما. فضياء بهذا الوقت قالنا إنه أنتم يعني هلا إنه إذا فات النظام الشبيحة على المشفى فأنتم يعني بتحسنوا بسهولة إنكم تهربوا، لكن نحن المصابين وأنا يلي ما عندي رجلين كيف بدنا نحن نقوم. فنحن ما كان مننا إلا بكل إيمان إنه نحن حنطالعكم قبل ما نحن نطلع، لكن شاءت الظروف إنه يصير عكس هذا الشيء. الشاب اللي كان عنده عملية بطن كان عم يترجاني إنه اسقيه مي، لكن أنا مع الأسف ما كنت أحسن بهذا الوقت إني اسقيه لأنه بسبب وضعه الطبي يعني. فأخذت شاشة بللته شوي بالمي وعطيته إياها لياخذ شوي من رطوبتها. طبعا ليومنا هذا بعد 10 سنين وأنا بقول يا ريتني سقيته مي. نحن طلعنا، يعني اجت السيارة أخذتنا وطلعنا. فبهذا الوقت سألناهم إنه شو مشان المصابين اللي جوا، قالوا لنا إنه في سيارة مباشرة جاية تنقلهم. لكن مع الأسف السيارة اللي كانت بطريقها للمشفى تعرضت لقصف والشباب اللي كانوا بجواتها ماتوا، وبقيوا المصابين داخل المشفى الميداني. بعد فترة شهر تقريبا اتسرب مقطع عن المشفى اللي كانوا فيها الشباب، بيظهر فيه اعتداء الشبيحة عليهم بالضغوطات النفسية، وحتى ببعض الضرب كان عم يضربوهم يعذبوهم جسديا وعنفوهم. حتى ضياء قالوا له إنه قوم امشي على رجلتينك، يعني إنه إذا بتحتمل تقوم تفلت مننا قوم امشي على رجلتين. كان مش يعني المقطع الفيديو بعد ما اتسرب على اليوتيوب كان جدا قاسي بالنسبة لإلي. كان يعني هو أكثر شيء كان ممكن إنه أثر على نفسيتي لفترة كتير طويلة، لأنه هدول الشباب اللي إحنا قعدنا معاهم لفترة وكنا حاولنا قدر الإمكان إنه نحن نساعدهم، لكن مع الأسف. آه، كمان من ضمن الأشياء يلّي كانت إنه من الشي اللي كان إنه دائمًا مصاحب لشعور الألم جوّاتي. آآ عند اللي كنا نحن بعد ما فات طبعًا بعد ما أخلينا المشفى وخلص إنه صار في عمليات التمشيط شبيحة الأسد عم تقتحم المدينة، فنحن رحنا تخبينا ببيوت يعني. فأنا فِتت على بيت مع زوجي وأختي. طبعًا بيت كان مو لإلنا يعني. اضطرينا نتخبى فيه. فاتوا قوات الأمن بما على أساس إنه هن الأمن، لكن هن أكثر ما يكون رعبًا يعني. نزلوا الرجال كلّهم اللي كانوا ساكنين بالبناية للحارة. حققوا معنا بشكل سريع. آآ بعدها نزلوا تحت. طبعًا كانت مناظرهم كتير مخيفة. آآ وجّهوا الروسيات على الشباب كلّهم يلّي كانوا واقفين تحت، لكن أنا ما احتمت إني ضل واقفة عم شوف، لإني كنت حاطة يعني كان يعني إنه خلص الاحتمال الكبير إنه هن حيقتلوا كل حدا تحت. سكرت البرداية وسكتت، لكن الحمد لله طلعوا الشباب ما قتلوا حدا بهذا المكان اللي أنا متواجدة فيه. آآ بعد ما يعني هن كانوا ما زالوا الشبيحة تحت الحارة. اتصل رن تليفوني، اتصلوا علي مجموعة من الشباب إنه في 7 مصابين متواجدين بنقطة معينة جنب جامع القُسيمة. طلبوا منّي إنه أروح ساعدهم، لكن مع الأسف ما كان فيني أنا أتحرّك نهائيًا من المكان اللي أنا متواجدة فيه. الشبيحة كانت مزروعة بكل مكان، قناصات كانت متواجدة بالأماكن، وأي حركة كان ممكن يقلصوا على أي حدا بيتحرك. حتى معدات طبية ما كان متواجد عندي، لإنه نحن أخلينا كل شي كان معنا مشان وقت فاتوا الشبيحة على البيوت ما يلاقوا أي أثر إنه نحن كنا عم نشتغل بالمشفى الميداني. مع الأسف أنا هدول المرضى ما باعرف شو صار فيهم، لكن كتير كان شعور بيحرق القلب إنه أنتم يعني في حدا بحاجتي وأنا ماني حاسّة إني أروح ساعده بسبب الحصار يلّي كان موجود حوالينا. آآ بعد فترة يعني بعد ما خلص تمشيط عمليات ضمن البلد، اتصلوا فيني تقريبًا يعني سادس يوم المجزرة، اتصلوا فيني من المشفى الوطني بدارية حتى أروح أتعرف على جثث متواجدة بالبرادات. فتت طلعوني على سيارة شحن كتير كبيرة، كان فيها أكثر من 50 أو 60 جثة. آآ نساء، أطفال، ورجال. كانت بعض الجثث منفّخة وبعض الجثث كانت عارية تمامًا، لكن أنا ما حسنت أتعرّف على ولا حدا. لإن كان من الصعب إنه نحن نتعرّف على هي الجثث، لإنه أساسًا كانت التعاليم الوجوه يعني معالم الوجوه مخفية. في منهم كان معذّب، في منهم كان مقوّس بالرأس. آآ يعني المنظر كان أشبه ما يكون إنه هو يعني أنا لهلّأ ما باحسن أتخيّل إنه هذا الشي نحن عشناه. هي مناظر شفناها مثل كأنه واحد عم يعيش بفيلم، بأفلام رعب. هي بشكل عام كانت هي يعني ما بعرف الوقت يمكن ما رح يسمح لي إني أحكي بتفاصيل أكتر، لكن هي المشاهد اللي ما بتروح من بالي نهائيًا. بتمنى لو إنه بعد هال10 سنين يعني نحسن إنه آآ نعمل شي لنطلّع المعتقلين اللي صاروا عند بالسجن، أو نعمل شي يبرد قلوب أهالي الشهداء. بتمنى أكون حسنت وصل جزء بسيط جدًا من القهر والعجز اللي كنا عايشينه بهديك الفترة. لأنه بصراحة رائحة الدم والموت اللي كانت معبية البلد بمحيطها خلال المجزرة وما بعد، لهلأ هو موجود بأنفنا. ما ممكن حدا يتخيل إلا اللي عاش وشاف هذا الشيء. آه، بشكل عام هذا هو الشيء اللي أنا هلأ حاليا متذكرته من الشهادة اللي أدليت فيها. هدول أكثر مواقف ممكن إنه بتكون عندي ببالي موجودة. وشكرا لكم جميعا على تواجدكم.
شكرا كثير. شكرا لك سماح، على على كل شيء عملتيه وعلى كل شيء عم تعمليه. نحن ممنونين كثير لكل شيء عملتيه، وممنونين لأنك اليوم شاركتينا شهادة صعبة. متأكدين تماما صعوبة أنك تراجع هدول الذكريات. شكرا كثير أنك شاركتيهم معنا. شكرا كثير أنك شاركتي معنا كمان بالتقرير. صدقا نحن وأهل داريا والكل ممنونين لكل شيء عملتيه ولكل شيء عم تعمليه سماح. حنتقل هلا لفادي. فادي كمان، فادي كان موجود بداريا أثناء المجزرة خلال هذا الأسبوع الدامي. فادي حابين نسمع منك، تفضل.
مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا كثير مازن وياسمين والجميع، واكيد شكر كثير كبير لسماح لكادر الفريق الطبي. يعني ما حدا كان متخيل قديش مهم يكون في مجموعه مسعفين. كنت تخيلوا يا جماعه انه مدني عم قصيف ما فيك تاخذه على المشفى. يعني مشفى موجود، ما فيك تاخذ مدني مصاب على مشفى لانه مصاب. يعني هي بحد ذاتها تهمه. وهذا مدني ممكن يكون طفل، ممكن يكون امراه، ممكن يكون آه، كبير بالسن. بتذكر بهي الأيام يعني 3 أو 4 أيام قبل المجزرة كان في قصف، وكان في كتير يعني ناس شهداء أو مصابين. كنا نحاول ننتقل. يعني ما بنعرف شو نعمل. يعني أنت كإعلامي ممكن بدك تصور، ممكن بدك توثق، أصلا ما بتعرف بدك تساوي، ممكن بدك تساعد، ممكن بدك تطمن على رفقاتك. وللصدفة إنه أنا عم بعمل هلا يعني عم شوف الشباب اللي عم يحضروا أو الناس الحضرانين هون. قسم كتير كبير من الشباب هن من داريا، أو من الحضور هن من داريا. كل واحد منهم حقيقة عنده حكاية. يعني إحنا هلا إذا مدركة مفتوحة للناس تشارك، كل واحد نعطيه 10 دقائق، كل واحد عنده حكاية وعنده قصة بتشيب شعر الراس. يعني إحنا بنحكي عن كل واحد عاش تجربة كتير منفصلة عن الآخرين. إذا بدي أختصر الوقت، أنا يعني بتذكر إنه لغاية يوم الجمعة مثل ما حكت ياسمين بالمقدمة، إنه أصلا طلع بيان من الجيش الحر، إنه بيان وتعمم على وسائل الإعلام وعلى الفيسبوك وهيك، إنه هن انسحبوا من المدينة. طبعا لغاية يوم الجمعة كان في إصابات، كان في شهداء، ولكن ما كان في ما يسمى بالمجزرة. يعني المجزرة اللي تم توثيقها القتلى بالعشرات وبالأقبية وبالأماكن، ما كان صارت. هي أصلا صارت بليل الجمعة. واللي صار انه مع قطع الكهرباء وقطع الموبايل وقطع الانترنت، انت اصلا ما عاد فيك تعرف شيء. ومعلوم انه هيك قصص كيف، يعني كيف تنتشر الاشاعات، كيف تنتشر الاخبار للناس، كيف بينتشر الرعب. يعني انتشر بكل المدينه الرعب. طريقه تحرك الجيش كان هو عم ينتقل يعني من قطاع لقطاع. يعني قطاع فيه مجزره، فيه وهم، فيه يوم قيامه، وورا بكون يعني يا اما ما فيها شيء او مخلف وراء اثار دمار وقتل. نحن وقت وصل لعنا الجيش، تخيل كان يوم السبت يعني، فهو وصل يعني للحاره اللي قبل حارتنا. آه، ما بنعرف يعني كان مجرد انك انت تكون شاب. يعني حسب ما سمعنا هي تهمه. يا جماعه لا يبقى ولا شاب بالبيت، ولا حدا يبقى ولا شاب، بس يكون في شاب عم ينقتل. يعني اي شاب لا حدا يبقى. ونحن كنا يعني انا واولاد عمي وبعض رفقاتنا يعني متخيل احنا اصلا بيوت عربيه مع ابنيه كلها منفتحه على بعض. ما عرفنا بدنا نروح بحالنا، احنا ما عرفنا وين بدنا نتخبى. يعني ولا شيء. جينا نحكي يا جماعه بدنا نتخبى بدنا نروح. الجيش صار بالحاره اللي بعدينا، لك ما فيك تسترجي تطلع، لك ما تعرف تسترجي تحرك سياره، ما تعرف وين في قناص، ما حدا بيعرف شيء. الفكره اللي خطرت لبالنا انه تعالوا نتخبى بالاسانسير، يعني تعالوا نتخبى بالاسانسير يا جماعه. تخبيت انا وابن عمي بالاسانسير، رفقاتي واخي ورفيقه تخبوا باسانسير ببنايه ثانيه، رفقات اخرين تخبوا بغرفه فوق الاسانسير. طبعا نحن كل تعويلنا لانه الكهرباء مطفيه، الاسانسير ما بيفتح بشكل كهربائي، يعني حصرا في له مفتاح تبع الامان، هذا هو الوحيد. لدرجه الرعب يعني انا وابن عمي بالاسانسير كل 5 دقائق له ابو ايمن نحن سكرنا الاسانسير، نحن قفلنا شيء الاسانسير. اللي والله ما بعرف. طب يا جماعه اجى الجيش، صاروا قراب، وين صاروا؟ يعني انت متخيل انه انت 24 ساعه متخبي باسانسير، لا اكل لا شرب، ما بتعرف شيء. 24 ساعه انت عم تترقب الموت، ما بتعرف شو بصير، يعني ما بتعرف شو صاير برا، ما بتعرف امتى رح يجي الجيش، ما بتعرف وصل وما وصل. وفجاه بنسمع بقى اصوات وهوش ودبابه واليات ومجنزرات، وبكون بلش بقى نسمع الصوت، اللهجه العلويه المعروفه للجميع، انه مين في هون؟ مين في هون؟ فيكم تفتحوا لنا باب الاسانسير؟ انا هون يعني انا وابن عمي توقعنا انه خلص احنا خالصين، يعني احنا ولهلا ما بنسى، يعني هذا الحكي صار له 10 سنوات يا جماعه. يعني احنا ربع حياتنا صار ماضي ربع حياتنا وقت اللي عشنا هي المجزره. وفعلا بمد ايده على الاسانسير، يعني بمد ايده على الاسانسير ما بيفتح، بقول لنا يعني بقول لنا عمي انه يعني هو بيحاول يصطنع البرود، ولكن يعني حياة الرعب بكل البيت. يعني عمامي موجودين، إن كان أخي الأصغر مني موجود، كان كتير صغير، يعني هو كنا عم نشوف إنه أنت بينظروا لك على إنك شاب لحتى تتخبى، ولا لا لساتك طفل. فنحن إنه هو طفل، بينما ابن عمه اللي هو أكبر منه يمكن بسنة مبين عليه يمكن شاب، فلا خليه يتخبى معي. يعني هيك صارت المفارقة. فعلا إنه بيفتحوا باب الأسانسير يعني سبحان الله، يعني مسكر الأسانسير. فاتوا لفلفوا بالحارة ما لاقوا حدا، بينما لو ملاقين مجرد شاب واحد كان التعامل راح يختلف. اضطرينا نبقى لانه من سوء حظنا ما بعرف شو اللي صار، الجيش قرر انه هو يبقى بالبنايه جنب بيتنا، يعني هو اعتمدها نقطه له. ونقلا عن اهلي وعن اخي وهيك، انه كان في كثير اصوات ضحك وتعذيب ورصاص ويعني ومسبات كفر بالبنايه اللي محتنا. لمجرد ما انه يعني صار ثاني يوم وطلع الجيش، طلعنا يعني بالفعل لقينا حوالي يمكن اظن 5 شباب من جيراننا مقتولين، مقتولين بالبنايه. كان في اظن كمان جيراننا بالبنايات اللي مقابلنا كمان كذا حدا من جيراننا كانوا مقتولين بالاقبيه. سمعنا كثير كثير قصص سمعناها من رفقاتنا. ناس كانت بغير منطقة، ما حكيت الجيش كان عم ينتقل بالوقت اللي أنا كنت موجود بمنطقة بيتنا. كان في آخرين بدأوا بالفعل هن يجمعوا الجثث ياخذوهم على التربة. في مقاطع أصلا انتشرت بهدليك الأيام، انتشرت فورا. يعني كان في ناس موجودة هناك عم تصور جثث، عم توثق. في نقطة كتير مهمة إنه إحنا عم نحكي عن شهر آب، يعني شهر 8 هو أكثر شهر حرارة. يعني وضع الرعب اللي صار بعدين، يعني أنا بعدها طلعت فورا وطلعت مع رفقاتنا وبلشنا نوثق صور الجثث ونساعد بالدفن وهيك. يا جماعة الناس ما عندها قدرة إنه هي تروح تتعرف، ما عندها جرأة تروح تتعرف على جثثها. الناس ما عندها جرأة. نحط الجثث نتركهم بالتربه، لك ما في كبير، ما في مختار، ما في حدا يجي يقول يا جماعه وين بدنا ندفن. يعني هذا شأن بلد، شأن ما له شأن ناشطين فقط، او شأن مسؤول التربيه الله يرحمه كان ابو صياح. يعني هذا شأن بلد. بس مع الاسف يعني الخوف كان كثير صعب، كثير اصعب من انك انت توصفه وتشرحه للناس، تحكي والله العظيم تحط الجثث تجيبوها الناس. في ناس تلاقي جثث ببيتها بمزرعتها تجيبها تلحش الجثة وتروح، يعني خلص بس وين عم يدفنوا الجثث؟ هي مكان التربه، يحطوا جثه ويروحوا الناس من خوفا انه هذا الشيء يسبب له ملامه. تندرك الجثث يعني ساعات طويله. حاولنا انه عن النت عن شيء، يا جماعه يلي بيعرف في حدا رايح له، لك تعوا بس تعرفوا على الجثث. انت هي الجثه متى ما صارت تحت الارض كيف بدك تعرفها؟ يعني حاولنا نصور، يعني مثل ما حكيت سماح، يعني حتى هي كمان قصه الجثث اللي اجوا بالبراد يعني بعد 3-4 ايام، انا ما بعرف بصراحه من وين هي الجثث. هل هي اعدمت ميدانيا وبعدين اخذوهم رجعوهم بعد 3 ايام؟ هل هي جثث اعدمت بارضها واتاخذت او اعدمت لاحقا؟ حقيقه ما بنعرف شو قصص هي الجثث. جابوهم البراد، وكمان كان في يعني كان في دفن جماعي، دفناهم كلهم. وكمان اي حدا يعني شوف، يعني انت دفن جماعي كان بتجيب تركتور بيفتح خندق طويل وبنحط الجثث. يعني هي الطريقه اللي كنا ندفن فيها، لا في شاهده لا في اسم. تحاول تصور، بس احنا عم نحكي يا جماعه احنا بشهر اب، يعني شهر اب انت الجثه خلال يومين بتختفي معالمها بس على الحراره. الحراره بتختفي معالمها. والله في ناس ما تتعرف على اهليها، وقلال يعني اللي قلبه قوي كان يروح على التربه. صورنا انا الصور اللي صورتها هلا ما طلعتها يعني انا صورت صور، ووقتها يمكن عملنا اظن صفحه على الفيسبوك نشرنا بالصور. انا الى الان ما بفتح هي الفولدرات. اذا حدا طلبوا لغرض توثيق او شيء بشاركهم معه، بس الى الان ما بقدر، يعني هذيك اللحظات حياتي ما بقدر ارجع لها. انا اسف جدا على الاطاله. شكرا جزيلا يا جماعه.
أهلاً فادي، شكرا كثير لك فادي. كمان ممنونين بكل شيء عملته فادي خلال وجودك بدارية، وكمان ممنونين لمشاركتك. شهد بنعرف تماما قديش صعب واحد يشارك ذكريات. حقيقة بتمنى تكونوا عم تقدروا تشوفوا الشات، سماح وفادي، كمية كمية الحب والدعم تجاهكم، لأن احنا فعلا فخورين وممنونين. I will switch back to English now to go to Sareta. It must be very difficult to follow such powerful and courageous testimonies from Fadi and Samah. But Sarita, based on your very long experience, the issues of accountability and war crimes, I would love to hear your opinions and feedback on the report. And how do you see this report and the Daraya massacre in general? How do you see it? How does it fit within the broader track for justice and accountability in Syria? The floor is yours, Sareta.
Thank you so much. I also want to particularly thank, of course, SBC, without whom the report wouldn't exist, but really to thank Sama and Fadi for speaking here today, and also for taking themselves back to what were truly horrific moments in their lives, and to allow those of us listening to understand better what the horror of what was experienced by those who were living in Daraya at the time that the massacre took place and in the days that surrounded it. In Syria is now, the entirety of Syria is a crime scene that has been a crime scene for many, many years. And it is a strong insight and constant reminder, including for those of us who've worked on Syria for a really long time, that for every crime, for every act of violence, it reverberates through the community. It's not simply the direct victim or the victim's family even. There are hundreds and thousands of victims that for each act of violence, it spreads out in the community and may affect those who survive for the rest of their lives. When we think about Syria on the whole, the scale of the horror is incredibly difficult to grasp. We're talking about, since March 2011, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been injured, some with life-altering injuries. Millions have been displaced. Many of those listening will have also moved from their homes. Some of them have crossed, some of them and you will have crossed borders in search of safety. And then, of course, we have tens of thousands who have been detained in circumstances where we know in the government detention centers, both official and unofficial, there are systematic use of torture, killings, sexual violence, and of course, tens of thousands disappeared with families and loved ones behind, waiting in anguish for any information about their fate and whereabouts. So when we look at Syria, the whole scale of the violence that has been suffered largely by civilians at the hands of their own government really underlines the urgent need for accountability. At the same time, it can be tremendously overwhelming when one looks at the scale, the size of the task that's ahead, when you're looking at millions of crimes. Here, I think that SBC really deserves a tremendous amount of thanks and congratulations for diving in deep into one of the massacres, the earlier massacres of the Syrian conflict, and showing a way forward in terms of how you can investigate in a survivor-centered, trauma-informed way that is ensuring that they are looking at a wide range of survivors, of gender, of age, to really come up with a picture that would otherwise potentially have been lost to the wider community. Of course, the community of Daraya will never forget what happened to them, but in order for it to ripple out across the consciousness of a wider group of people, this report is invaluable and important, and I hope it will be a much needed push forward when it comes to accountability. To date in Syria, where we've seen accountability being more successful, or at least tremendous resources being put in, have been in cases of detention centers generally. And there are lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into the panel into now on the panel, but it's also really important to spend our time looking at essentially these things that happen outside of detention as the military move into areas, what happened in those areas. So that's one thing that I think is notable about the report, is just the focus on what was really a government incursion and resulting in a planned massacre of men, women, and children. We forget, I think, how the shocked reaction to the news of the Daraya massacre at the time. The summer of 2012 was incredibly brutal in the Syrian conflict. It was a time of multiple incursions by government forces into restive areas, including Tremse, Al-Hula, and Daraya, among others. At the time, the Daraya massacre made headlines, including one Western reporter who made their way into the city afterwards, calling it a city of ghosts and dead bodies, echoing some of the survivors' recollections. The city smelled of death for days, weeks, and in some cases months afterwards. For this, because the Syrian conflict began to intensify even further after 2012, a lot of the documentation efforts that have occurred in the subsequent years have really focused in on the period, I would say 2013 to 2017. And so the SBC has also done tremendous work in drawing our attention back to a horrific massacre, but one which has been completely underdocumented within the incredibly wide and deep pool of violations that the Syrian people have suffered. Even at the time with Daraya massacre, the UN Secretary General, who was then Ban Ki-moon, called the killings an appalling and brutal crime and called for an immediate investigation. Navi Pillay, who I think was the head of OHCHR, the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the time, so she was deeply shocked by reports of the massacre and also urged an immediate and thorough investigation into this incident, while criticizing the Syrian government and cautioning that the actions may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. As the report itself indicates in its summary, there were findings by the UN Commission of Inquiry in its report on the massacres of the incursions of 2012. But largely after that point, the Daraya massacre remained underdocumented. And I would not say eclipsed, but there was certainly the brutality of the later years of the conflict drew people in all directions as people sought to document violations that were spreading all over the conflict. So why is this report important? Obviously, it's important just by the nature of it itself, that it's documenting something that might otherwise not be well known outside the community that was affected. As Yasmine has said, it records the atrocities perpetrated in Daraya based on testimony of survivors and victims, meaning that their accounts are now enshrined. There's a record that people can draw on from posterity. And it also shows that even 10 years later, one can still collect a substantial amount of evidence, and that accountability and justice can be prioritized even for these more challenging areas to document. I was very glad to see that the report will be shared with groups such as the Syria mechanism, which can then also leverage the incredibly hard work done by SBC, but also the bravery of people like Sama and Fadi of coming forward to see how this fits within the larger puzzle of investigations that are going on across the world, but particularly in Europe into crimes committed in Syria. It's also really important because the Daraya massacre, as you read about it, in particular, the decision to surround and essentially besiege the area, shell the area from outside, and then move into the area and doing door-to-door searches, resulting in mass civilian casualties through execution, also forms an early prototype for what became a very common mode of attack by the Syrian government in towns and villages and areas across Syria later on. So it really gives an insight into how the Syrian government began to hone its response to areas which they perceived to be insufficiently loyal to them or welcoming of the opposition forces. I hope sincerely that this report will move forward the needle when it comes to addressing the urgent need and the need for justice and accountability, and to ensure that survivors' voices are amplified. There's one final point that I'd like to make, and that is around the methodology of the report, because I think often, for understandable reasons, we focus on substance, but here I think I want to highlight the importance of how SBC approached putting this report together. Much of this report, the testimonies collected during the pandemic, which posed, as all of us know, particular challenges in all of our work. But they made particular efforts to ensure that these interviews were conducted with the survivors' well-being at the center of how they worked. And that they had trauma-informed methodology. They also really sought, if you go through the report early on, to ensure that they were capturing a wide range of perspectives. That includes perspectives from men and women, but also perspective across age groups, so that when you're reading the report, you're not simply getting a view from one section of the society in Daraya. You're really understanding how different people experienced the horrors of those 5 days in August. As Fadi had said in his presentation immediately before mine, you can speak to a number of different witnesses and they will all have different personal experiences of what they went through during those 5 days. I think SBC has made a tremendous effort to produce a report which reflects the full range of the experiences, often very similar experiences, but experienced differently by the people who lived through them. Also, they made a tremendous effort in their own team to have a gendered, competent team, that you had different people on the SBC team that were going out. And so you have already different perspectives, different understandings of the world, different lived experiences, not only through the interviewees, but also the interviewers. I'd also really like to say, as you know, I am a senior legal advisor with Center for Justice and Accountability, CJA. We worked with SBC on this report. That I'm hope that the model of working through something that is sustainable, ensuring that Syrians and those who have links to Syria, who will be doing this report and are committed to doing this work for a long time, are given support, are empowered to build skills and to put those skills to test, but also a model that is not extractive. Neither CJA nor SBC were going in and simply taking statements out, taking stories and using them. It was very much both centering from CJA's point of view the role of SBC, but from SBC's point of view, clearly centering survivors and victims. And I think that is what also makes this report incredibly strong and incredibly, I hope, enduring as a force to push for justice and accountability for the people of Daraya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sareta. Thank you so much for the CJA for your support. As Yasmine said, it was essential actually for the SBC to be able to produce such a report. Now, I will move to Mohammad. Mohammad, I'm going to ask you a similar question to Sareta, but I know you're going to provide the Syrian perspective. Sareta provided some sort of an international legal perspective, but I would also love to hear from your own personal experience, since you're personally engaged within the wider process of justice and accountability. I'd love to hear your feedback on the report, and also how do you see this report and other work and the Daraya massacre, how does it fit within the broader process of justice and accountability, and what is happening in the process of justice and accountability right now? I'd love to hear from you, Mohammad.
Thank you, Mazen. Thank you, everyone. And many thanks for SBC for working on this excellent report and for putting this panel together. I salute Samah and Fadi for their courageous testimonies here. And such work is really important to preserve the truth about what happened. And this may be a good entry point to start here. Just recently, we started as JAG doing some open source investigations, basically looking at a lot of available videos that's on YouTube. Nobody touched them. And stories we know very well, like double tap. A flight will hit somewhere, and then rescuers will go there with medical teams, and a second attack will happen in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, deliberately targeting aid workers and rescuers there. And we realized this work is kind of known, this story for everybody. It's covered in media, but has not been thoroughly analyzed, documented, organized, and that has not been shared with entities like the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM. And that's why we became very pleased with the results of going through hundreds of those videos and talking to witnesses. Similarly, I felt equally about the Daraya report by SBC, because as known as the story of Daraya and as known as the activists of Daraya and their bravery and the courage they spoke on in public, actually, nobody went in this scrupulous way into the evidence and collected information. SBC had access to exclusive footages clearly because they're from the city. They know the people and people trusted them, and there's this linkage and relation there. And they were able to collect a wide narrative, 24 interviews, excellent interviews in depth, in details, statements like Samah's statements. All this shows that there is actually a big value of doing this work even 10 years after the fact. So stopping and just sitting and laying backwards, like, no, it's all the story, everybody knew about it. Like, no, that does not mean evidence were sufficiently collected, appropriately preserved and shared with justice mechanisms. So thank you again, Yasmine, for all this work and for leading these efforts with SBC and with CGA for their support. The second item here is, we've seen a shift now and a swing in the public opinion internationally about the Syrian government. We've seen statements coming from, including the UK Special Envoy for Syria, who just said today that the UK thinks, or the West thinks, the external pressure is not going to change the regime. Maybe we should have a conference where we bring the opposition and the regime to talk to each other. We've seen Turkey changing its position. We've seen a lot of Arab League countries trying to invite the Syrian government back to the Arab League. Without this documentation and without laying the ground for blocking such normalization, it's going to be easier for the Syrian government just to go back to the normality and as if nothing happened, as if 100, 700 people were not killed in Daraya and other people were not killed in Syria and chemical weapons were not used in Syria. So this type of documentation makes it difficult to sweep everything under the rug. And we look at, in Syria, we look at our neighbors in Lebanon and Iraq. We had the civil war in Lebanon. And what after 15 years of fighting, it was easy to pass an amnesty, blanket amnesty to everything, because nobody documented and everybody killed everybody. And it's like, just let's pass the amnesty. A lot of the warlords ended up being members of parliament, ended up being cabinet ministers. And the missing people and the victims in Lebanon still suffer till today. 100,000 plus missing Lebanese, they have no answers. If you look at Iraq, where a bad justice mechanism happened there, a tribunal that opened the can of worm and the Iraqis didn't really bring any meaningful justice and a sense of redress for the Iraqi people, because it was politicized and there's no sufficient documentation in it, and there's a lot of interference and interventions from outside. So without appropriate documentation and a work similar to this report, it will be difficult really to engage in meaningful mechanisms that the Syrians feel redressed really after this mechanism, not about checking off a box where an international mechanism started or didn't start. A third point, before I go to the unfortunately not super positive side of the justice track in Syria, a third point is actually what Fadi and Samah touched upon, both that it's impossible to identify some of the bodies. So we have a lot of basically, and this is repetitive across Syria, we have a lot of bodies that are unidentified and buried, sometimes in mass and collective situation, mass graves. Work on identification is really important. And if you want to, at any time in the future, re-excavate this mass grave and collect samples from it and do appropriate work. And we've been doing forensic work in northeast Syria for the mass graves left by ISIS, since we have physical access to Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. But without having the context and the contextual investigation collected appropriately, and you don't have good knowledge of who might be there and who are the missing people in Syria, you will running a risk actually and missing out of any identification in the future for those victims, because it's an inherent part of the rights of the families as well to understand the people who identified their loved ones. They have some closure that X is dead in this day, and they know that. But a lot of people, they don't know if their loved ones are detained on a checkpoint, were taken somewhere else, were killed and executed in the city, were buried in this grave or in graves outside, so forth, so on. And of course, 16 dead bodies at least appear to be burned in Daraya alone during this massacre. So this is in general very important for the families, very important for the future. There's now a discussion in the UN. There's a study will be published hopefully next week by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, discussing the prospect of having a dedicated missing persons mechanism for Syria to search for the missing people. Of course, here we're talking missings and detainees, but also unidentified missings in mass graves is equally important, and hopefully to be part of the mandate of the mechanism. So this work makes it difficult for any delusioned diplomat to say, oh, nothing happened here. People can go back to their life, and as long as there's no active combatant in the street and there's no fight, Syria is safe, or Damascus is safe, which is some governments start spreading this narrative. Denmark started that, and then Turkey follows suit now, with Turkey trying to change the tone of their diplomatic engagement. Now, going to the international justice track, which is, it's no surprise to anyone, we don't have much success there. An international criminal court referral was vetoed in 2014, was double vetoed by Russia and China for clear purposes. Or for clear reasons. And we expect Russia will be even more inclined to veto after they participated militarily in the conflict, because they committed war crimes and crimes against humanity with their air forces. So if they vetoed in 2014, they're more likely to veto today. So that kind of blocks the path for the ICC, which leaves us also establishing a special tribunal for Syria would require a Security Council resolution, also blocked by such veto. The only viable option is the universal jurisdiction cases being filed in Europe. And with its limitation, with its ups and downs, it's proving to be a good interim solution for now for a community of victims, to be honest, that does not have any other weapons, doesn't have any solutions. So identifying perpetrators who made it to Europe among refugees and just changed their clothes and became civilians and smuggled themselves with the civilians is an important work. But also collecting the statements and testimonies and evidence, and having the numbers and contact information of people like Fadi and Samah ready to be shared with the prosecutor if we identify any of the people who appeared in the Daraya massacre to be based in a country in Europe. That's very important work. So laying the groundwork in such investigation is really important. Some of the issues with the universal jurisdiction cases is that there will be no absentia trials, and the maximum you can reach if you file a complaint today. If families from Daraya in Europe file a claim, let's say in Germany or in France, we might get international arrest warrants. We've seen those happen, issued by the German federal prosecutors against Ali Mamlouk and Jamil al-Hassan. But pending the arrest of those people or surrender or extradition by a third country, trials will not proceed in these settings because this is part of the national legislations in these countries. So there's some more could be done in this area, but also the truth is it's very, very long-term battle. It's incremental. It's going to take a lot of efforts. It's going to take generations. So if Fadi thinks he documented things and you think they're going to be missed out or lost, or just share them with SBC and with IIIM. That's a good, important step you can take now. But also, the expectations of the families and working with the families and setting their expectations right about what's expected, how we can do this work, and how long this battle will take us to reach any tangible outcome. And a lot of the expectations at the beginning, and we've seen this more in the chemical weapons use, which happened almost a year after Daraya massacre, that the more grave the human rights violations is, more likely the international community would do something about Syria. We'll have a better policy, a more engagement, kind of intervention, a no-fly zone. That didn't happen. We've seen these escalations happen from one side to side to side. And eventually we landed in the conclusion that's a very difficult pill to swallow, honestly, for the Syrians, that nobody is here for us. And nobody is actually coming to rescue us from this. And we have to do this work ourselves, relying on Fadi and Samah and Yasmine and support of CGA and a lot of brave witnesses. And that's important because we don't want this work to go to vain after all these 10 years, even if there's any potential for reconciliation with the government by the international community, not necessarily by the victims. Here, probably Sareta is better than me in bringing those international examples, but ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, nobody expected detention or arrest letter of Karadzic and Mladic from day one. The way the proceedings started, a kind of semi-universal jurisdiction method and then transfer to the tribunal, all this could give hope to the Syrian that this will change a little bit. Nobody saw Ukraine on the horizon, which made it very difficult to negotiate anything with the Russians, including the cross-border resolution renewal for the humanitarian aid, but also made Putin to become more vulnerable. There's discussion about international tribunal in that scene. There's more pressure against Russia. If Russia loses militarily somewhere or Putin is ousted by any way in Russia for domestic issues, this will have a positive impact on Syrians. I don't want to be very delusional also about our hope, but we've been governed by hope, as it says in Syria, محكومون بالأمل. We don't have other options. Actually, we have to continue this work. Otherwise, it's a double loss. We lost the people and we lost the opportunities in the future, and we might reach a point where anything meaningful possible, but we don't have evidence for it. That's why I want to thank again SBC for all the work they've done. I'm done with my comments. I have one final comment to say that the systematic nature and the state policy of this massacre was very, very, very visible from the number of the diversity of the intelligence and military units that engaged, the Division 4, Republican Guards, Air Force Intelligence, some Iranian Hezbollah support. And that's similar in nature to other massacres happened elsewhere in Syria. And this is something I've seen about, and I've talked a lot about with the UN. It's unfortunate the UN treated Syria based as just any other context. They follow the same textbook of conflicts, like, oh, we'll condemn a little bit, we'll demand monitors, we'll demand an investigation. But what's happening on the ground, actually, the regime was testing the international community step by step and see if there's no reaction with this massacre. We're going to go replicate it elsewhere. We've seen in Al-Hawla, we've seen it in Talbisa, we've seen in Rastan, we've seen in Judaydat Al-Fadl, which is across Daraya as well. We've seen a lot of places where also door-to-door summary execution happened in a daylight, and it's well documented. And when it didn't spark international reactions, that escalated to use more heavy weaponry like air forces and then chemical weapons. And it's sad, but it's a truth to say some of the use of these heavy weapons did not stop unless international parties intervened. And there's two incidents here: the chemical weapons, where the US threatened with a credible threat to use force against the Syrian government. And the Syrian government signed the prohibition of the development of chemical weapons after 50 years of resisting and surrendered big part of the arsenal of chemical weapons. And the second element was the Scud missiles, the ballistic missiles that Bashar al-Assad was launching all the way from Damascus to Aleppo, that took 7 to 8 minutes to hit Aleppo, but then destroyed whole blocks because it was massive missiles Those were stopped and get out of service only when Israel hit Qasiyun Mountain and get those missiles out of service altogether, because the regime was preparing to ship them to Hezbollah. So we were put aside, and the international security, national interest for all these nations were put first, and we benefited in the side, but we should keep this in the agenda. Sorry, I'll stop here, Mazen, and open it for discussion.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Actually, you kind of answered a lot of questions that were raised in the Q&A, such as Mariana's and Eva's questions. They were asking about how to link this with the universal jurisdiction based tribunals in Germany. So in a way, also within your intervention, you answered some of the questions. Looking at most of the questions, now I will go back to Yasmine. I will ask a similar question to you and also to Sareta. Looking at most of the questions, if not all, they're all revolving around the benefits, the impact. Why are we doing this? What's going to happen next? What are the benefits of documented such massacres and producing these reports? Of course, understandably, it's coming from a place of frustration, a feeling of futility, and all of that. So, Yasmine, I would love to hear your comments on this specific issue.
Yeah, thanks, Mazen. First of all, I completely understand the frustration, and it's a frustration that we all feel. You know, as Mohammad mentioned earlier, feeling let down by the international community, and knowing that there could be something that could be done, and seeing world powers not acting certainly lends us a blow. But also something else, and so I feel like I'm going to be picking up on a lot of threads that earlier speakers mentioned, that as Syrians, you know, Syrians have suffered tremendous losses, and they're not backing down. So if the victims, as long as the victims aren't backing down from asking for their rights, then the right can never be lost. And you also mentioned the example of Bosnia, and we have, you know, 30 years down the road, and we're still seeing perpetrators being identified. I think I want to also take a step back and note that accountability, civilian protection are very much international interests, even though we have seen an utter failure of the international community in responding to Syria. The reality was, it's always been in the interest of the international community as a whole to ensure that civilians are protected, and to ensure that these atrocities, A, don't happen, and B, are appropriately dealt with when they do happen. And Ukraine is perhaps a very powerful example of this. Syria effectively served as a lab for Russia, and we mentioned Russia's direct military intervention earlier. Russia was testing new weapons. It was testing the might of its military force. And we see the very same patterns happening today in Ukraine. The same patterns of attack, the same types of targets. And we see even coordination between Syrian activists and Ukrainian activists in terms of how to respond, how to document, what's the best way to avoid these kind of attacks. And so we see that because there was that lack of accountability, firstly, because of the atrocities committed by the Assad regime. Secondly, when Russia intervened directly militarily, that led to another outcome, which is Ukraine, and which will continue to lead to more and more, not immunity, but more and more escape from accountability if these things don't, if they go unchecked. The reality is that there are a lot of legal difficulties with securing convictions, and those were touched on. Syria is not a member of the ICC. We have the Russian veto, which also prevents us from establishing a specialized tribunal. Universal jurisdiction cases also have their own difficulties because A, you need the country, the host country, to be willing to exercise universal jurisdiction. And secondly, you need to have the physical presence of the accused on the soil of that country to be able to put them to trial. But I think it's nevertheless important to document, because there are still other processes that are taking place for which the findings can plug in, or at least serve as part of that push. We mentioned earlier the process of normalizing with the regime. And findings such as these, and it's not just going to be SBC's report on its own, but it's going to be the Tadaman massacre findings, for example, plus reports by, I know the Syria Justice and Accountability Center is in the process of releasing other reports. And it's just these compounded reports that add to the pressure. This is what's happening in Syria. This is what has happened. This is what's continuing to happen. You can't normalize your relations with this kind of regime. Also, it helps to push forward the demands of Syrians who have either suffered losses themselves or know others who've suffered losses. So, for example, uncovering the fate of detainees, releasing the detainees who are still alive, respecting and upholding and maintaining property rights. These are all issues that we continue to advocate for. And I just want to conclude with one last point here in terms of what's the benefit. It's putting that as a record for history. This is what has happened in the August 2012 Daraya massacre. And sometimes it's even important for us to remind ourselves as Syrians, because there can be this complacency sometimes, or this desensitization. I saw this appear several times in the chat, for example. We become desensitized, we give up, but reminding ourselves of these atrocities can also push us forward and ensure that we continue to advocate for the justice that we will obtain someday, maybe not now, but in the future.
Thank you, Yasmine. A similar question, Sareta, but let me rephrase it. You were involved in the IIIM and in the Commission of Inquiry in Syria and Libya, and there's this question actually is asked by a lot of attendees and even by myself. Giving this overwhelming amount of evidence and these numerous massacres and crimes against humanity and gross violations of human rights, why haven't we seen any tangible results on the ground from the COI, from the IIIM, from these international mechanisms for justice and accountability?
It's a good question. It's not the first time I have been asked that question, which I'm so surprised is no one. One thing that I always try to emphasize in these conversations around the need for justice and the urgency of justice is not to raise expectations that justice is always just around the corner. For those of us who have been working, whether on Syria or in other situations of mass atrocity, you'll know how much work it takes to even move a couple inches forward of trying to get the meetings you need to get, trying to meet with the prosecutors, of building the cases. So justice can take a long time to achieve. And I think it's really important that we are always honest with victims, with survivors, with relatives of the disappeared, so that we're not increasing their anguish by giving expectations that cannot definitively be met. Often what we are doing is putting in place case building efforts so that when an opportunity arises, and that opportunity could be, for example, someone crossing a border into a country that's got strong universal jurisdiction that's willing to make the arrest, but it can also be, winds of change at a political level that open up opportunities, open up possibilities that didn't exist because of use of veto power, because of willingness to provide, to dedicate funds towards different kinds of accountability mechanisms. So a lot of us are assuring that when opportunities strike, we are in the best position to move forward to bring these cases. You're right, there have been a lot of efforts on Syria. We've had everything, the COI Commission of Inquiry in Syria, which is still running. It's the longest running commission that has ever existed. You have the IIIM, but you also have OPCW, you have structural investigations. So why is it that it takes a really long time to build these cases? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is often it's incredibly clear what crimes have been committed. The barrier in Syria is not understanding that the Syrian government has committed crimes. That is understandable. Even in very specific instances, you can usually drill down to say, this is likely, there are reasonable grounds to believe this is a crime against humanity. The following crimes against humanity have occurred: murder, torture, sexual violence, and so on. But you need more than simply recognition or even evidence of a crime. For trials, you're not putting the government on trial or any group on trial. You're putting an individual on trial. And so that often relies to having a chain of linkage from the violation on the ground, the crime that's committed on the ground, linking upwards to people in power. Now, what we've seen is where there have been successful prosecutions, there have been people that have been relatively what I call crime adjacent. They're very close to where the crime has been committed themselves, right? That's, you know, in the case of the Koblenz trial, you're talking about people who were in the detention center, who were seen by people on the ground. You're not speaking about people who are 3, 4, 5 levels up, who may have had command of, you know, multiple detention centers at the same time. So chain of command has been incredibly difficult. It will continue to be difficult, to be honest, unless you have access to either paperwork or you are willing to essentially flip people who were once inside who are willing to speak. And that is something I think ultimately the survivor and the Syrian community need to think about, talk about, and be prepared for. Because there may be people who have committed crimes and their value is going to be they get punished less if they can reel in people who are more responsible. But that is already a challenge. The second is really ensuring that they are present in a jurisdiction that can try them. And at the moment, because of the path to justice is very narrow, it only goes through a few states, it means we're still quite limited in where we need those people to step into in order to have a chance of detaining them and putting them on trial. Nevertheless, we move forward in the hopes that the path to accountability will widen. There will be more avenues to accountability, and that when that time comes, that these cases will be ready, these survivors will be ready. But that is of course to recognize for those who have lost people, for those who are living daily with trauma, none of this I think is very is satisfying to hear. And I think that also needs to be acknowledged, that more needs to be done and that people are waiting. And I just want to echo one thing that Yasmine said, although I scarcely imagine I can say it better than Yasmine has done, which is that when you're a victim or survivor, when the community itself is mobilizing itself to collect and do these documentations, one, it's very sustainable, but two, it's also undeniable. You are putting yourself and saying, we cannot be ignored. Politicians will do what politicians will do in the end, but whatever choices they make knowing what we have suffered, they make knowing that we are making our voices heard. And so I think it's incredibly important, even if people are jaded by the length of time it takes to see any semblance of justice, even if they're fatigued by people calling on them to step forward and give their testimonies, as SBC surely had to go, and when they had to go and start doing their investigations of speaking to people and convincing them that this was worth spending their time to give their testimonies, that it means that what you've been through cannot be denied. And it serves as a powerful reminder that nothing about what the Syrian government can be done can be turned away from or forgotten. Just through expedience.
Thank you so much, Sareta. Before asking my final question to you, Mohammad, I just want to quickly answer one of the questions was raised by Afra. Afra was asking if any international newspaper actually published something about our report. Yes, today The Guardian published a very detailed coverage of our report, and just to be honest, The Guardian has been a great ally for Syrians and for the seekers of truth and justice. To be honest, that's something maybe we discuss later. There were more international attention comparing to Arab attention, to Arab media attention to this report, and the same thing actually happened with the Tadamon report previously. Going now to you, Mohammad, and we have to finish in 4 minutes, because we promised the translators to finish in time. Mohammad, a question. Sareta talk about proving the chain of command in order to be able to kind of have a meaningful tribunal. And I know that the Syrian Center for Justice and Accountability, you've done an amazing work. You published numerous reports about some of the leaked documents from the Mukhabarat, one of the branches. And I know you and I discussed about this issue before, about this kind of chain of command and how to prove that. So I wanted to ask you this question, or just kind of trying to end on a positive note. What is the future for the process of justice and accountability? What kind of evidence do we have, and are you optimistic about this process in general?
Thank you very much. Indeed, we have around 500,000 pages of the government intelligence archive. A lot of these were smuggled from neighboring towns and cities to the border, where it was lost to the Free Syrian Army. And in some of it, we had videos filmed inside it, showing humanitarian aid boxes stored inside the intelligence facilities. A lot of these documents had routine day-to-day work, but a lot of them had orders, and linking these orders to each other is what we've been doing for the last couple of years. We published one massive report, Walls Have Ears, processing 5,000 pages of those documents. And now we are concluding in October an effort to review, analyze 15,000 high-level documents from those. What some of the trends we've seen in those documents, there is, and this is very important, we're preparing actually to hand these documents to any established missing persons mechanism for Syria. A lot of centralized and systematic practices around detainees. So Damascus not only know of the detainees of the other branches, they supply the branches with templates to be filled with the name and the age, and the branches respond saying, here's the list of the children and women in our branch according to the template you gave to us, and all these facts back and forth with the fax numbers there. So a lot of information about targeting hospitals, specifically field hospitals, a lot of information about surveillance. We've done a paper on surveillance, targeting schools. We recognize these schools used by the armed groups, so we hit them with the artillery. We have on YouTube separate videos published by individuals we don't know, showing the schools were targeted. So there's enough linkage evidence to bring it up to the chain of command. What we did also, we went in a thorough analysis of the intelligence structure, and we kind of restructured the intelligence, including the crisis management cell and the National Security Office. We have those people by name and signature, and they cannot deny their existence and their participation and their knowledge of these crimes. And these were handed to a couple of the governments who are, or a couple of prosecutors, let's say, who are involved in structural investigations in Europe. So we don't have shortages of evidence, really. So part of the issue here is having suspects on the soil of a country had jurisdiction in Europe, and also the diplomatic immunity play a role here, because you cannot prosecute heads of state under universal jurisdiction. So you have to be somebody below head of state. Without having appropriate people, yes, you can get an international arrest warrant, but again, it's going to be more advocacy of its nature, more than accountability. And here, in less than a minute, just I want to bring to the attention that we also, in our internal discussion with our team, we differentiate between accountability and justice, because you could put person behind bars for what they've done, committed crime, but would that make us feel redressed? Would that make families hold back together? Not necessarily. That's why we should look, and we are looking at a wide variety of activities, including the missing persons mechanisms for Syria, looking for truth memorialization efforts, such also the Daraya report plays a big role in memorializing what's happening here, preserving the narrative about the conflict, fighting against impunity in general. And this is all incremental, and there's going to be a lot of small pieces contributed by a lot of other players, not only the UN in this game. The Syrians definitely are doing their share.
Thank you so much, Mohammad. And we came to the end of our session, our event today. On behalf of all of our members and in the Syrian British Consortium, we are truly thankful for the amazing investigation team led by Yasmine, for the support by CJ, and of course for our panelists and friends, Mohammad, Fadi, Samah. Fadi and Samah, we are eternally grateful for everything that you've done, and we are grateful that you shared with us some of your, I would say, cherished memories, despite being very painful, but we are truly grateful to hear from you today. Thank you so much for the attendees, who actually, a lot of them, or all of them actually stayed to the end. Again, if you would like to see the report, to read the report in Arabic and English, it is now available on our website. Thank you so much for coming here, and let's hope we will bring justice to the kid that was Samah treated. Thank you, everyone. Have a have a good rest today. Hopefully we'll see you later. Thank you.